In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the myths about Adolf Hitler in World War I, which culminates in the biggest myth of all, and that is why he decided to become a politician. This myth led to the construction in National Socialist times of a large monument with a shrine, the remains of which you will see in this video. This video will be somewhat controversial, as some of these myths have been accepted as fact by many, but that is what I tend to do anyway, to challenge commonly accepted facts by evidence-based history. These myths I'm going to present here were to a large extent created initially by Hitler himself when he wrote Mein Kampf, but by this time he was famous, having attempted to overthrow the democratically elected government of Germany by a coup in a Munich drinking establishment. After he was granted power in 1933 by a cabal of wealthy conservatives, this myth-making increased enormously. As always, this is real history, research-based history. I will show you some of the locations as they are today, and I also have some archival film material, although none with Hitler in it. I also need to point out up front that the quotes from Mein Kampf are my translations, which may be slightly different from others. When World War I started in 1914, the 25-year-old Adolf Hitler thought that it was a great idea, and he was really enthusiastic about it. 10 years later, Hitler was in prison and he wrote his memoirs in Mein Kampf. This book cannot be treated as fact, as even in his opinion, Hitler was writing about something that was meant to be a propaganda piece now that he was famous. However, as far as his reactions to World War I and how it started, I think he was probably writing how he felt at the time. Hitler had suffered poverty and a feeling of frustration. This was now an end to his vexed feelings of youth. Overwhelmed by tumultuous enthusiasm, he sank to his knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart. A struggle for freedom, Hitler wrote, had begun, the likes of which the earth had never seen more powerful, for as soon as disaster had begun its course, the conviction dawned on the broadest masses that this time it was not a question of Serbia's or even Austria's fate, but the existence or non-existence of the German nation. The overwhelming majority of the nation had long since grown tired of the perpetual state of uncertainty, so it was only too understandable that they no longer believed in a peaceful settlement of the Austro-Serbian conflict, but hoped for a final confrontation. I was one of those millions. I've done a video on Ludwig Wessel, who was the father of Horst Wessel, who wrote the song which was to become almost the national anthem of Germany during the Nazi period. Ludwig Wessel was an evangelical vicar. Because some of his sermons were published, they've survived, and I note a very similar tone in the sermons of Ludwig Wessel to what we read in Mein Kampf, and probably could be replicated many times over by those on the extreme nationalist right. Wessel never knew Hitler and probably never heard of him for that matter either. He died even before the beer hall putsch. However, my theory is that churchmen like Wessel, representing the interests of the wealthy conservative establishment elite, have a lot to answer for in creating after the war the disillusionment that followed defeat and the stab in the back myth. And if they didn't create it, they at least, or they certainly, promulgated it. It's worth pointing out that amongst all the photographs of the cheering masses going off to war, that the largest demonstration ever in Germany to that time was one which was opposed to the war. In total, around 750,000 people participated in anti-war demonstrations in the lead-up to the First World War in Germany. Nonetheless, Hitler and Ludwig Wessel, for that matter, convinced themselves somehow that either Germany wasn't free or it was the aims of others to make it not free, and thus the entire people themselves had desired the war. As far as Hitler was concerned, the myth-making started even before he signed up, although the myth was created many years later. A photograph taken in Munich's Odeonsplatz purports to show him there. This very famous photograph shows the young Adolf Hitler, then aged 25, cheering the outbreak of war in the Odeonsplatz in Munich on the 2nd of August 1914. War had been declared on Russia the previous evening at 7:10. 15 years later, Hitler was chatting to his friend, the Munich photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, at his studio. Whilst showing some photographs Hoffmann took on that day, Hitler mentioned to him in passing that he was at the Odeonsplatz on the 2nd of August 1914. Hitler said words to the effect of, "I should actually be there. I was there too. I was here, standing at that part of the square." As a result, Hoffmann said later, the 5 remaining photo plates from that day were carefully examined, and nothing was found. It was only when a 6th photo plate magically reappeared a few weeks later that Hoffmann made the discovery. "I only had to look for a moment. There is someone. Yes, it's him. It's the same hairstyle. It's his face. It's him. It's him." But when one thinks about it, is it him? Are we to believe that Hitler, who appears to have his Hitler moustache here, dropped it when he joined the army, then went back to it later? And whereas the face seems somewhat similar, is this not the effect of the hairstyle? And why does the face appear fuller? Forget that he's smiling, which he almost never seems to be doing in photographs. A war has just started, so he has reason to be happy. A close examination showed that the hair had been retouched. The glass plate for the photograph is missing, which of course, had it existed, would have proved that the photograph was real. The plates for the other photographs that Hoffmann took on that day are preserved. I therefore leave you to make your own conclusion, but I have made mine. There were other photographs of the rally on Odeonsplatz published in the Illustrated Beobachter in 1930, but none of them had the future dictator. It could be, of course, that Hoffmann wanted to do a favour for his friend Adolf by creating the photograph of him in the Odeonsplatz, so that would not count as forgery. In the same way as if you use Photoshop to manipulate your grandmother into the Westminster Abbey coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953. However, if your grandmother then used that photograph to aid her into becoming an evil Nazi dictator, then that would be fraud. And that is what Hoffmann did. This photograph was first published on the 12th of March 1932 in the Illustrated Beobachter on the eve of the Reich presidential election. The sensational find was made accordingly, and a enlarged section in the manner of a magnifying glass drew the reader's attention to the current presidential candidate. The caption read, "Adolf Hitler, the German patriot." August 1914, when tens of thousands of Munich residents listened to the last standing music on the historic floor in front of the Feldherrenhalle, suddenly the German national anthem broke out across the square. In the middle of the crowd stood, his eyes shining, Adolf Hitler. In the previous election campaign, Hitler's opponents attacked the Nazi leader for fleeing military service in the Austro-Hungarian army and therefore questioned his patriotism and willingness to fight for his country. In this situation, The photo fit perfectly into the Hitler propaganda message. Hitler's opponent in the election was war hero Paul von Hindenburg. Why would any nationalist choose an Austrian draft dodger over the man who won the Battle of Tannenberg? The picture really became popular after the Nazis came to power. On the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the war in 1934, the Völkische Beobachter printed it, and it has been used many times since in many countries. I can recall it from a book at school, as I'm sure many of you can too. Adolf Hitler joined the Bavarian Army as a volunteer on the 16th of August 1914. As a foreigner, he had to apply for permission to join the army. In those days, each German state had its own army, and although we might refer to the German army, but this is just a matter of convenience. So in the case of Bavaria, it was the Bavarian Army headed by the King of Bavaria. On the 1st of September 1914, Adolf Hitler was assigned to the 1st Company of the 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment. It's worth mentioning here that even if Hitler didn't put this in Mein Kampf, many of the volunteers went absent without leave, even before they were put on trains heading towards the front. Now, obviously, I don't know, but I assume that this must have been obvious to Hitler, particularly as research has been done on this unit, above all in the recent years. On his way to the front, he may have seen evidence of German crimes, the wanton destruction or indeed heard of the murder of civilians. Years later, as the partisan war was beginning in occupied Yugoslavia and in the Soviet Union in September 1941, he referred to arson and mass shootings as an exemplary method of fighting partisans in the East and combating sabotage. Hitler participated in the First Battle of Ypres at the end of October 1914. Here, Hitler's unit took massive casualties, and this has become known as the Kindermord, the killing of young men who were little more than children with hardly any military experience, who for love of fatherland and Kaiser came up against trained British regular troops who mowed them down. Well, that's the myth anyway, and the first time I saw it was in a museum in Ypres, and I naturally believed it. It continues to be generally believed that the 4 reserve corps of the German Fourth Armies were made up largely of young war volunteers who just left school. This, however, is not true. The 4 Army Corps were by no means made up of up to 75% school children, teachers and students, as is often stated, as this would have been impossible in mathematical terms alone. The Statistical Yearbook for the German Empire lists a total of 40,761 students as being in military service for the summer semester of 1914 and the winter semester of 1914-1915, with the actual strength of the 4 Army Corps at 120,000 men. Every student in the entire country would have had to have been concentrated here to ultimately reach a proportion of only 30%. The regiments were actually largely made up of reservists, Landwehr members, other volunteers, and a few active soldiers. Just to give an example, the Reserve Infantry Regiment number 211 states the following personnel: 166 active soldiers, 299 reservists, 970 volunteers, not all of whom were students or pupils, 1,499 militia members, and 1 reserve. The Reserve Infantry Regiment number 244 states that of 2,883 men, 7% had the 1-year volunteer certificate, and that 1/3 of these were students, bringing the total to 66 students. Another example is the 1,000-strong Reserve Jaeger Battalion number 26 from Freiburg, which is said to have been made up largely of students from the Freiburg Mining Academy. But according to the Statistical Yearbook for 1914-1915, there were only a total of 160 students serving in the war here. Another story is that these youngsters attacked the enemy at Langemarck while singing the German national anthem. It's widely believed, and it's a bit like the story of the British troops who allegedly saw angels at Mons. However, in neither case is there a contemporary record of it being witnessed by anyone, and I'd be curious to know how they managed to concentrate on their singing whilst under artillery bombardment and being shot at. I've heard the argument that they sang as a means of identifying themselves as German to avoid friendly fire, but with the artillery at least 1 kilometre back and perhaps as far as 4 kilometres back, then all I can say is they must have been singing very loudly. It cannot be doubted that some units took enormous casualties, and there was a very good reason, therefore, to create this myth. The attacking units had been hastily formed and thrown to the front without sufficient training and with inadequate equipment and leadership. This is the real reason for the devastating losses at Ypres. Thousands of soldiers were killed who'd only arrived at the front at the end of October as briefly trained recruits. To cover up their failure on this sector of the front, the German leadership later invented the alleged sacrifice of German youth, knowing full well that this wasn't true. The Langemarck myth was based almost exclusively on the German army report about an attack by young regiments of the 23rd Reserve Corps west of Langemarck on the 10th of November 1914. By this time, the failure of the German attempt to break through at Ypres had already become obvious. This is the real reason for what happened. Nonetheless, the story was politically exploited, especially during the Weimar Republic, and even more so during the Third Reich. And there are today books by serious authors who've written really good books, but who have repeated this, particularly when writing about the life of Adolf Hitler. You will note that I haven't mentioned any names because their books are otherwise very good. On the 1st of November 1914, Hitler was promoted to Gefreiter, which is usually translated as corporal, although Lance Corporal or Private First Class are probably better translations. The early promotion was probably due above all to the losses his unit had suffered. After a few days of fighting, Hitler was possibly the most senior person available. From the 9th of November 1914, Hitler served as an orderly and messenger between the regimental headquarters and the battalion headquarters, located approximately 1.5 to 5 kilometers from the main battle line, depending on the situation. Messengers had to be physically fit. Maybe Hitler had toughened himself up since failing his Austrian medical not so long previously, or maybe he was the best they had. I suspect it's the latter. In any case, this role was to prove to be important only 6 days later. On the 15th of November 1914, the 48-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Philipp Engelhardt, commander of the Royal Bavarian 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment, came under direct French fire northwest of Messines during the First Battle of Ypres. The regimental command post was completely destroyed by a direct hit, severely wounding Engelhardt. His life was possibly saved by 2 messengers, one of which was the 25-year-old Adolf Hitler. For this act, Adolf Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class on the 2nd of December 1914. 10 years later, the now retired Major General Engelhardt attempted to return the favour and campaigned for Hitler not to be expelled from Germany following the Beer Hall Putsch. Now, I prepared a video on the story of his wife, and this is a real riches to rags story in Nazi Germany and later in East Germany, but you'll have to see the video to get the full story. Hitler was not a frontline soldier during this time, although the incident with Engelhardt clearly shows that he was not out of danger. He was just somewhere a little less dangerous. However, the term rear-line pig has been used referring to him, which is perhaps unfair. No, it's not perhaps, it's absolutely unfair, given that he probably didn't ask to be a runner, but was told to be one. On the 24th of December 1914, there was an unofficial Christmas truce on the front lines. Whether or not this happened in Hitler's sector, I don't know, but he certainly heard of it, as according to his letters home, he completely disapproved of it. On the 5th of February 1915, he described the fighting in detail in a letter and concluded by saying that he hoped for a final reckoning with the enemy within, thus showing already the beginning of a conspiracy theory. From March 1915 to September 1916, he served in the Aubert-Fromelles sector, some 15 kilometers south of Ypres and over the border in France. On the evening of the 19th of July 1916, after 3 days of heavy artillery fire, British and Australian troops attacked the German position. The 6th Bavarian Reserve Division in the Royal Bavarian 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment gave up very little ground and successfully counterattacked the next day, retaking the little ground that had been lost. On the 5th of October 1916, Hitler was wounded in the left thigh by a grenade splinter at Le Barquet in the commune of Ligny-Thilloy. He was sent for treatment at Belitz Sanatorium in Potsdam, which had been converted into a reserve military hospital. Hitler was here until the 4th of December 1916, and he later commented that it was here that he noted a dwindling enthusiasm for the war. He must already have heard it in the trenches, but chose to ignore it, as it would not have gone with the theory he was attempting to promote after the war, that it was the German soldiers who were stabbed in the back. Did it really take him this long to notice the lack of enthusiasm, or was he so excited by the war that he didn't even notice? Hitler didn't return to his unit until the 5th of March 1917. It had been relocated to Vimy, which came under attack on the 9th of April 1917 in a battle that lasted 5 weeks. On the 31st of July 1917, the British attacked, launching the Third Battle of Ypres, which went on in horrific conditions until November. And if you ever get the chance to see the museum to this battle, then I really do recommend that you see it, because it gives a really idea of the horrendous conditions in which people fought the battles at Passchendaele. In March 1918, the Ludendorff offensive began with major advances for the Germans. In May 1918, Hitler received an award for outstanding bravery and the Wound Badge in Black. On the 4th of August 1918, Hitler received the Iron Cross First Class for a report to the front after all telephone lines had failed. The regimental adjutant, Hugo Gutmann, who was Jewish, had promised him this award for this. The divisional commander approved it after 2 weeks. Now, there's a completely different account in the film Hitler, the Rise of Evil, but remember that this is, to a large extent, fiction based around events that really happened. As the Allies counterattacked and the German line crumbled, Hitler had the good fortune to be sent on a course on the 21st of August 1918. This was a telephone operator course in Nuremberg, which would last 1 week, and after that Hitler had regular leave owing to him. It does seem to me be a little strange that somebody would be sent away then, but it's not strange enough to be suspicious. Let's remember that by this time the German line was absolutely crumbling. On the 27th of September, Hitler returned to the Western Front, where his regiment was now affected by the disintegration that had begun to happen across the entire German army. It is the army that is disintegrating, not the civilians, as the stab in the back myth later claimed. On the morning of the 14th of October 1918, Hitler was caught in a mustard gas attack whilst on a reconnaissance mission near Verviers in Flanders, which he also described in Mein Kampf. At this stage, the war was over for Hitler, and he wouldn't return to it. But this led to the biggest myth-making exercise of all. And before coming on to that, let's have a look at Hitler in the trenches. According to contemporary witnesses, Hitler behaved submissively towards officers. Respect your superior, contradict no one, obey blindly, he stated in court in 1924 as his maxim. As far as is known, he never complained about mistreatment as a soldier, thus isolating himself from his comrades who were probably constantly complaining, and that's what soldiers do, and anybody who's ever been in any military will back me up on this one. Because of Hitler's attitude, they insulted him as a white raven, a German expression for someone who considers himself to be special or who held an opinion that differed from the majority. According to their statements, he didn't smoke or drink, he never talked about friends and family, and he wasn't interested in visiting brothels or even talking about women for that matter. He just sat for hours in a corner of the dugout, reading, thinking, or painting. Now, according to a Channel 4 documentary, Blueprint of a Dictator, which claimed to examine Hitler's DNA, Hitler suffered from Kalman's syndrome, and as evidence to back this up, we have the report of Hitler's medical from Landsberg prison after he was arrested following the beer hall putsch. This medical reports that Hitler had only one testicle. It is also possible that because of this medical condition, he had a micropenis, which would certainly have led to insults from the others. This would have no doubt have made him a bit of a laughingstock and probably make anyone of that age very angry. And this, in part, could explain why he was such a loner. I need to point out that that is just, of course, a theory. After 1933, the National Socialists, Fritz Wiedemann and Max Amann, claimed that Hitler had refused a military promotion for which he would have been considered as a multiple wounded soldier and recipient of the Iron Cross First Class. This may be the only acceptable explanation of why he wasn't promoted. Other reasons, of course, are also possible. It needs to be remembered that once Hitler came to power, those that had known him then would likely to be able to benefit from the highly corrupt Nazi state. The fact that so few people are known, in my opinion, speaks volumes. As for Wiedemann and Amann, they made a great deal of money out of their former association with Adolf Hitler. At this moment, we now need to consider the beginning of the Hitler myth, that of his stay at the hospital in Pasewalk and the end of World War I, which he described so eloquently in Mein Kampf. This is Pasewalk, today in northeastern Germany, not far from the Polish border and the very large city of Szczecin. When I lived in Szczecin in 1995, I went past the road sign for Pasewalk every day and thought that I ought to visit the town, the place where Hitler had been when World War I came to an end. It took me until 2024 to do so, nearly 30 years later. When I went to Pasewalk on an August summer Sunday, it resembled a ghost town. Hardly anyone could be seen in the streets. Despite being 1/3 of a century since the collapse of East Germany, the dominant architecture remains what I would call very DDR-ish.
Skręć w prawo.
Here? You're joking? Oh no.
This, of course, should be no surprise. During the fighting in late April 1945 in the war started by Pasewalk's most infamous patient, large parts of the town were destroyed. However, somewhat miraculously it would seem, The medieval city walls remained intact. I didn't have the address of where the hospital was where Hitler had been treated. There were no signs to direct me. However, it was easy to find. The street was Schützenhausstrasse, and it was logical that the Schützenhaus would once have been there. It was right next to the spa where the tree still stands, which in Nazi times was reputed to be the spot where Hitler had decided to become a politician.
Po 100 metrach skręć w lewo. Następnie dotarłeś do celu.
Skręć w lewo.
Lekko w lewo. Następnie dotarłeś do celu. Po 50 metrach dotarłeś do celu.
This might look like a field anywhere. It's hard to believe that in this fallow field, one of the most important decisions in the 20th century was taken. Or maybe it was taken here. National Socialist legend had it that it was under this tree, which for a brief period in its life was called the Hitlerlinde, that Hitler decided to become a politician. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's go back in time to the middle of the 19th century. Then, this field was part of a brickworks located just outside the town. In September 1859, a local business person, Christian Darling, bought it. He converted it into a restaurant, which was described in his advertising brochures as having attractively landscaped gardens. Other construction projects included a hotel, a hall with a stage, and a shooting range for the local Schützenfest, from which the building eventually got its name. Schützenfest means Marksman's Festival in German. Business was so good that by the turn of the century it was one of the first buildings in the town to be given a telephone number 363, which meant that bookings could be taken, assuming of course that the person making the booking had access to a telephone. The area to the north of Berlin, indeed a whole swathe of territory from the Elbe to the Niemen rivers, is that of what I have seen described as a region of black lakes. Maybe they're not so black, but lakes dominate. This area was popular with tourists from Berlin and other places. This meant that Pasewalk had good rail connections whilst maintaining an air of being away from it all. In the summer of 1914, as the Second German Reich went to war, it requisitioned 7 properties in Pasewalk, a school, 5 large private houses, and the Schützenhaus buildings. The Schützenhaus buildings were equipped with beds for around 30 patients, who were cared for by 15 doctors, nurses and orderlies under the direction of Wilhelm Schröder. The requisition happened so quickly that I'm sure that this was planned well in advance of the war, in the case that a conflict should begin. I'm sure they do that today as well, that many buildings have been designated to be requisitioned should a conflict or major disaster happen. As the war progressed, it's unlikely to have offered such good conditions for the wounded. The number of beds would have been increased, and there was an effort to have a quicker turnaround of patients. The ratio of medical staff to those needing their attention also suffered. The Pasewalk Schutzenhaus was for the lightly injured, those that needed medical attention and observation, but who could be expected to be in good enough condition to return to their units within a short period of time. It was not equipped with advanced surgical equipment. To a certain extent, it was more like a place where the injured could have a rest whilst remaining under medical supervision. On the morning of the 14th of October 1918, Adolf Hitler was near Vervick in Flanders. There was a mustard gas attack from the British lines. Hitler later described it in Mein Kampf. If the poison got into his eyes, the eyelids would quickly swell up and cause severe pain, leading to functional blindness. If there were no complications, the symptoms often disappeared completely after a few weeks, as was the case with Hitler. Those wounded in this way were classified as lightly wounded. We might not consider today that blindness caused by gas poisoning to be a light injury. However, we need to consider the conditions that existed at the time. With the classification of a light injury, Hitler was admitted to the Pasewalk Reserve Hospital on the 21st of October 1918 under the number 7361 with the diagnosis gas poisoning. The convalescence usually lasted 4 weeks. Let's now jump forward a quarter of a century. In 1943, Dr. Karl Kroner told US naval intelligence that he had treated Hitler and had been unable to diagnose any physical damage. According to Kroner, Hitler was then examined by the psychiatrist Edmund Foster, who diagnosed him with hysteria. When I was preparing this study, I tried to get a definition of the word hysteria as it was used at the beginning of the 20th century. Although the condition had been documented as far back as ancient Egypt, until the end of the 19th century it was presumed to be something only females suffered from. This was changed above all by Sigmund Freud, although of course others were involved too. The best definition I can give that hysteria is an uncontrollable emotional excess and can refer to a temporary state of behaviour, mind or emotion. Today, hysteria is not accepted as a medical diagnosis, and the blanket diagnosis of hysteria has been fragmented into many other conditions. There has since been speculation that Foster treated him with hypnosis, which was one of the cures advanced since the end of the 19th century. I think it highly unlikely that Foster treated him at all, and for that matter, I think it dubious that Kroner treated him. Due to the scant records we don't know, I think that Karl Kroner was attempting to make himself necessary to US intelligence in order to facilitate his visa to the United States. He'd been in Iceland since 1938, doing odd manual jobs despite being a highly qualified neurologist. His German qualifications were not recognized in Iceland. He had been forced to leave Germany by the Nazi regime's persecution of Jews. My interpretation is that accusing Hitler of having a condition which until not long before had been seen as being something which affected only women is a way of belittling him. Furthermore, I suspect that the cure of hypnosis is suggested for conditions at the time to suggest madness. Whether or not hypnosis cures what may be described as hysteria, I don't know. But I learned a method in France for language acquisition using hypnosis, and the results were outstanding. However, it very much depends on the ability of the teacher and how calm the student is and how willing that student is to go under hypnosis. From my highly limited experience, I would suggest that Hitler, no way, was someone who could have gone under hypnosis. Hitler described in Mein Kampf how he learned of the end of the war and his decision to become a politician as follows. On the 10th of November, the pastor came to the hospital to give a short speech. Now we found out everything. I was extremely excited and was present at the short speech. The old, dignified gentleman seemed to be shaking very much when he told us that the House of Hohenzollern was no longer to wear the German imperial crown, that the fatherland had become a republic. What followed were terrible days and even worse nights. I knew that everything was lost. Only fools or liars and criminals could hope for the mercy of the enemy. During these nights my hatred grew, hatred against the perpetrators of this act. In the days that followed I also became aware of my fate. I had to laugh now at the thought of my own future, which had caused me such bitter worries only a short time ago. There is no pact with the Jew, only the hard either or. Thus I decided to become a politician. Here we have a photograph from the Pasewalk military hospital. At the front in the middle we have Dr. Wilhelm Schröder. But who is this character at the back? Does he remind you of anyone? I accept that he does look a bit like Adolf Hitler, and if this photograph dates to November 1918, it might well be him. But to be quite honest, if we're looking at people in the photograph, I think that this gentleman looks more like Stalin, and I'm going to presume that he didn't just pop round to Pasewalk Lazarette in November 1918 to see his future ally Adolf Hitler. In any case, none of those shown here appear to have any really serious injuries. Of course, it could be argued that those who did have the serious injuries weren't in the picture. The story goes on that Hitler lost his sight again after learning of Germany's defeat in the war. Hitler himself said this in Mein Kampf. In 2011, Dr. Thomas Weber of the University of Aberdeen, the author of Hitler's First War, made a discovery that might confirm this in the form of 2 letters. Dr. Ottfried Förster, a renowned neurosurgeon, wrote to 2 prominent American neurologists, Victor Gonda and Foster Kennedy, that he had seen Hitler's medical records showing that he was treated for hysterical amblyopia, a psychiatric disorder known as hysterical blindness. Dr. Ottfried Förster was a leading neurosurgeon. His fame was international, and he had treated Lenin. He was the leading authority on neurosurgery in the 1920s and 1930s, and he received students from all over the world. He had requested and seen Hitler's medical file from Pasewalk Military Hospital in 1932. He had requested it as by this time Hitler was becoming quite famous. The career of Dr. Ottfried Förster did not progress under the Nazis, but he was not persecuted by them either. He held on to his position here in Breslau, now Wrocław, until his death in 1941. However, I reject this argument. I'm not suggesting that the record was forged or that anyone deliberately made anything up. However, it does not fit the circumstantial evidence. Whereas it might explain how Hitler suddenly became so full of hate as a part of a psychiatric disorder, we still don't know why Hitler was released from hospital so quickly after this diagnosis. In any case, I've done a separate video on the hysteria of Adolf Hitler, and a link will be posted below once the video has been uploaded. Hitler left Pasewalk on the 19th of November 1918 as fit for military service for the replacement battalion of the 2nd Bavarian Infantry Regiment in Munich. In other words, he was fit for military service only 9 days after allegedly losing his sight and then regaining it again. Let's remember that 1 month was the usual period to spend in hospital with the injuries that Hitler had. So it was completely normal that he would be released then. What is not normal is that he lost his sight again. I suggest that, at most, what might have happened is that Hitler may have blacked out for a few moments after learning of the defeat, but this was something he recovered from very quickly. However, it suited the later myth. He took the train from Pasewalk to Berlin. In the capital, he must have witnessed the events of the German Revolution. By the time he got to Munich, it's possible that he participated in them. Hitler recounted his experience in the hospital in Mein Kampf, but here Hitler was not recounting historical events, but rather, now that he was famous, was attempting to create a myth. The idea that the lowly wounded soldier, while suffering from blindness, should attempt to put right the wrong of the stab in the back was appealing, particularly the bit about losing his sight again on learning of the defeat. I think the first time Hitler thought that he decided to become a politician whilst in Pasewalk was when he was writing his book in prison in 1924. There's no record at all of him saying this to anyone else beforehand. The place of the myth, however, became a place of National Socialist tourism during the 1930s, like the prison in Langemarck where Hitler had been imprisoned, and those are places associated with the 1923 attempted putsch. Franz Feder Coburg, whom I've mentioned in other videos relating to Coburg, was in June 1934 the Gauleiter of Pomerania. The National Socialist House Cooperative Pomerania, GmbH, was founded in order to create a shrine at this location. The land was purchased at the end of 1934. The old building was razed to the ground. A single-storey building with 2 wings and a gabled central section was then built, with a consecration hall and a spacious parade and assembly area. The consecration site was opened to the public on the 21st of October 1937. Hitler himself was not present, but the ceremony was carried out by his deputy, Rudolf Hess. A hall of honour was set up with mosaics. In another room, a bust of Hitler stood on a high pedestal, which was always illuminated electrically. Above it was the epitaph, "Thus I decided to become a politician." Although a visit to Pasewalk is only a day trip from Berlin, Hitler himself never visited this place. He didn't have to. The myth had been created. A large part of Pasewalk was destroyed in the fighting at the end of April 1945. The shrine was also largely destroyed, and what was left of it was destroyed by the Soviets. Today, very little remains except for concrete blocks and parts of the wall at one end of the field, whilst at the other there's a part of a building which appears to have been part of the shrine. Nonetheless, at the nearby Lindenbad swimming pool, built as part of the shrine, there still stands a now 200-year-old linden tree. One legend has it that Hitler conceived his plan to become a politician under it. So obviously he was not so blind that he couldn't wander out of the hospital and sit under a tree where he planned how he was going to run the country once he came to power. Of course, I could be mistaken, but we've got these stones lying here, and I'm going to suggest that these stones here are part of the Nazi memorial which Rudolf Hess had built. I mean, I don't know, they might have just been put here yesterday. Well, that isn't part of Rudolf Hess, that's a transfer station, Schützenstrasse, but this one here as well, these 3 here, that I all think. Not only that, I'm going to suggest that the trees were part of that monument. So these are clearly remains of I believe a sports field which was to be here. How did I manage to work out that this place was where the military hospital was, where Adolf Hitler was brought? To be quite honest, it wasn't terribly difficult, although I admit I wasn't absolutely certain. The place was called the Schützenhaus. And given the fact there's a Schützenstrasse, I mean, I sort of put 2 and 2 together, and in this occasion I made 4 and not 3 or 5. So that's how I managed to work it out. So I came here and I was looking for the appropriate location. I knew about the existence of this wall, what it looked like. I also knew of the trees at the back. And of course, I mean, trees could be anywhere, of course, couldn't they? I mean, I'm not very good at trees. I don't even know what type of trees they are. But I knew the shape of them, and that with everything else, and I knew of the shrine, and there was that funny building at the end. I knew of all that, so that's how I worked it out that it was here. I mean, often you've got things in archives and things, you try and put them together. And I think sometimes we can all make mistakes, and we can change our minds and things like this. In this case, I've got one of my professors called the smirk, and when the smirk is when you know after a bit of research that you are correct. And so in this case, I do believe myself to be correct. This being Germany, there's no signs up here whatsoever. I mean, it's strange actually, because even when I went to Karenhal last year, and they had some signs up there, and that was absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And we've got these houses down there, and I saw somebody building on one of the houses, a couple of people, and I was thinking, do they know what actually happened here? And for that matter, do they even care? I know part of the strip is out of bounds, and the reason for that, I don't know. I mean, it could be that there's something there you're not supposed to touch, but then again, it would be I think, be more warnings if that were the case. Maybe because the developer doesn't want people going on there because it's going to be developed. But then again, I can't imagine here an area where people are actually leaving as being all that attractive for developers. Anyway, so that's how I managed to work it out. It's just a matter of logic. There have been many studies on Hitler's time in Pasewalk, what happened to him here and what effect this had on his future life. I tried reading some in preparation for this expose. They use a lot of long words I don't understand, and some go into very complex medical analyses. However, in doing so, I think they're missing the point. My opinion is that it's been blown out of all proportion, and that this has happened by not looking at the historical facts. Hitler was in Pasewalk as a wounded soldier. He spent the same amount of time here as anyone else would have done in his condition, and then he left. Only later did Hitler decide to make a myth out of it. Whilst convinced of his own righteousness, he wrote his biography in prison, trying to make a legend of a story that happened to tens of thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. In this, Hitler was very successful, as others have added to this myth by giving all sorts of complex medical discussions on the subject. The myth remains of his conversion to becoming a politician at Pasewalk, which is just that. It's a myth. It's something that didn't happen. Meanwhile, the site of where this conversion took place awaits a developer. Thank you very much for listening. In follow-up videos, I'll look at Hitler's own opinion whilst he was writing in Langemarck prison and later to be published in Mein Kampf. This is, of course, important to events that happened in Nazi Germany and, above all, to his conduct as military leader. It's often stated that Hitler warned everybody about what his rule would mean, and he wrote it all down in a book. But it's also overlooked that his book gave a blueprint for his role as a supreme military commander in times of war. I upload every day at 2000 hours my time, Central European time. I live in Germany and in Poland. I do a longer documentary type video every Friday. On Tuesday, there's a shorter video, which might be a walk around of me visiting somewhere and giving comments on it. And on other days, there are short videos of up to 3 minutes in length. If you are interested in genuine research-based real history, then you might choose to subscribe to know what I'm uploading and when I am up doing live talks and the subject of those live talks. I also offer channel membership where for £5 or $6 or €6, you have access to currently over 800 members only videos, as well as having early access to videos like this one. But for the moment, thanks for listening. All the best from me. Bye for now.